The National Assembly passed the Electricity Regulation Amendment Bill this week, and it marked a historic moment in the country's approach to electricity regulations and its broader energy framework. And for more on why this is significant for me and you as the consumers is Ellen and Overy's Council and Energy and Project Specialist, Alexandra Felekis. Thank you so much for your time, Alexandra. Now, talk us through this amendment and how it's expected to secure long-term energy stability and spark transformation within the energy sector.
Thanks for having me, and really happy to be here today. So very much the objective of the Act is it lays the legal framework for moving our electricity sector to very much a vertically integrated monopoly sector with basically, having our electricity sector within Eskom's hands to now transforming that into a competitive and multi-market approach. And simply speaking, what that means is what we've basically had for decades is that Eskom generates electricity, supplies electricity, transmits electricity, and distributes electricity to end users. What the Act basically allows for now is that private sector participants can generate, trade, supply energy, transmit, and even distribute energy. So it's opening up the market in that there can really be real private sector participation in our energy space. It liberalizes our market. What's also really important about it is it acknowledges the unbundling of Eskom and sets a framework for the unbundling of Eskom. And what I mean by that is the establishment of the transmission system operator, or currently, because it's established, the National Transmission System Company of South Africa, which will actually manage this multi-market electricity sector for the South African government and our economy.
Now, Alex, implementation plays a major role in this transaction actually working. And one thing we've been struggling about in this country, or struggling on, is implementation. So what does that successful transition hinge on? So,
I think before we even look at how it's implemented, I think there's two important things that I wanted to raise about, I think, the misapprehension in respect of what this bill is going to do if it basically is assented to by the President in the next few months, is that it isn't a quick fix to load shedding. It eventually will assist in securing additional sources of supply, which obviously would meet demand. But what's very important is that it's a first step, and a lot has to be done until basically there's additional sources of supply that outweigh Eskom's supply. So the NECOM's plan in respect of load shedding is still very important, and it's obviously being implemented within the ambit of the Act. But for as long as Eskom is the main supplier of baseload supply in South Africa, and until we have a developed gas market and utility-scale battery projects that are actually affordable, we're still very much within the ambit of relying on Eskom and NECOM to solve our load shedding issues.
Well, thanks for bringing me back to reality there, Alexandra.
Yeah, I just think it's important because obviously that is one of the fundamental objectives of the Act, which is security of supply. But it's just that it still will take some time. And there obviously are other measures that are being undertaken outside of the Act that obviously will still curb load shedding within the next hopefully 1 year, 1 or 2 years.
No, carry on.
Ahead. Another point that I think is really important is, will it automatically drive down electricity prices? And that's also there isn't a simple answer to that either. Obviously, the rational answer is more competition for supply should obviously then drive down electricity prices. But again, we still are in the hands of Eskom, because Eskom owns and supplies 90% of South Africa's generation capacity, and they would still do so for the near future. What this basically means is that it's Eskom assets that potentially are dispatched. The majority of generation capacity that is dispatched are Eskom generating assets, which means fundamentally in the near term, Eskom will still set electricity prices. And until Eskom's generation assets are actually unbundled and disaggregated in a real way, we fail to see, in the short term at least, how this would drive down electricity prices. But in the medium to long term, once you actually have real competition in the generation side of the energy sector, that should be the case.
And Alex, you do say that it will take some time. What are some of then those risks and challenges that must be considered when introducing a new energy system such as this into a market like South Africa?
So very important, and we've looked at this with our partners in other international offices like Europe and the UK, which effectively have seen energy transition over, 30 years, from same as us, a vertically integrated electricity sector that was then liberalized and then that continued to adapt. And from our perspective, what's very important is private sector participation in every aspect of the energy sector. So as I mentioned before, generation, supply, transmission and distribution. And when you make that statement, what becomes very important is that you've actually established a framework that is conducive to private sector participation. So, a framework where you will have private sector entities investing and you will have, third-party banks funding energy and transmission projects. What's also really important is to have interconnected transmission and distribution facilities and enough capacity on those facilities. At the moment in South Africa, we have considerable grid constraints, which is actually curbing security of supply and the reason for why we have load shedding. And the Act obviously does have in mind solutions to that problem, but that's very important as well. You need an independent and capacitated transmission system operator because they manage this whole multi-market structure. What the private sector has been quite concerned about is the fact that although TSO will be an independent company, it is still wholly owned by Eskom. And as you know, Eskom is one of the biggest competitors within this multi-market structure. As I've just explained, basically responsible for 90% of our generation capacity. It's for this reason that the Act has actually provided that the TSO, or the National Transmission System Company in its current structure, would only be that way for the first 5 years after implementation of the Act, which gives us insight into the fact that the TSO might not always be related to Eskom generation, which is giving the private sector a lot of comfort. You need appropriate regulation and in some aspects deregulation. So in order to have a competitive sector, you actually don't want the regulator setting what the price should be. You want the market to determine what the price should be. But that's obviously only possible where you actually have a functioning market that's actually achieved security of supply without oversight from government or regulatory interface.
Alex, thank you so much for those insights, and certain that it's a conversation that will continue to develop. Of course, that's Alexandra Felekis with Ellen and Overy. That's where we'll have to leave it for this Sunday.